Hello, everyone. I am Sevdanur, and I'll be doing the introduction for today. I'd like to greet everyone, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today for the fourth of our CRC Book Talks series. We are delighted to have Dr. Zuleyha Keskin here from all across from the world, Australia, to talk about her book, Attaining Inner Peace in Islam, published by Springer in 2021. Her book is the first to discuss this topic from an Islamic theological perspective, providing a unique intersection between Islam and psychology. Dr. Zuleyha Keskin is an associate professor and course director for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University in Melbourne. After completing her master's degree in Islamic Studies, she went on to earn her PhD in the School of Theology and Philosophy at Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. Besides her academic work as a lecturer at CSU, she is working as the managing editor of the Australian Journal of Islamic Studies. She is the vice president of the Australian Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies, and she is also the co-founder of ISRA Australia. Dr. Keskin has 15 years of experience teaching to a range of audiences, from high school students to youth and adults within the Muslim and non-Muslim communities. Now, without further delay, please welcome Dr. Zuleyha Keskin. The floor is yours, Dr. Züleyha. Thank you.
Thank you, Sevdanur, for that lovely introduction. It's lovely to be with you all. It just want to give you an indication of how Zoom connects us. It's 10 a.m. here in Melbourne, basically. And like I was mentioning, we're expecting a clear 29-degree day today. So we really are on the other side of the world, literally speaking, but it's great that we can be connected the way we have. What I will be presenting on is inner peace in Islam. So this was my PhD topic as well, which took me painfully, I think, about 6 years to complete because I was working full time as well. So for those of you who are doing a PhD, there is light at the end of the tunnel, just to let you know. If I can do it, you can do it. And then I did convert my PhD into a book, as Sevdanur mentioned, and that was published last year. I guess before I go into the topic, I want to give you some background as to why I chose this topic. Why did I choose to write on this? Well, Said Nursi's work has been written on extensively, I do believe, in the English language as well. But what I found when I was reading his work was that he was really creating a formula, or providing, or offering, I should say, a formula about how to, I guess, understand the world around us and how to interpret the world around us to give us inner peace. That was the message I was getting. And I suppose I wanted to do a more thorough research, and that's what I did. And that's how I came to this formulation that I have. Now, is my sound good before I continue? Nodding? Yeah. Okay. All right. I've had sound issues with my laptop. I'm a bit paranoid. Okay, so when we're talking about inner peace, so when I talk about this topic, it really is from Said Nursi's perspective, because but what's important to highlight is Said Nursi's perspective is the Islamic perspective, because when he writes, he's referring to the Islamic teachings, the Quran and Hadith, but he's taking on an interpretation or understanding or expanding on that information in a way. I believe that the 20th century or 21st century, he lived in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, a person can understand and relate to. So that's the approach that's taken. Now, to start with, what do we mean by inner peace, and what do we not mean, is a good question. Inner peace does not mean we are going to be happy all the time. I don't want us to think that we can forever be happy and we'll never have, emotions like sadness and hurt and pain in our lives. That's really not what we're talking about here. Inner peace does not mean everything will go smoothly in our lives. So it's that's also, if we are sort of aspiring to that, it's never going to happen. We will be tested and challenged, and these are the kind of, I guess, messages that Nursi is trying to address. And inner peace means that we are able to give meaning to life events so that we have a level of contentment. Ultimately, that's what inner peace is. When you are approached with hardships, when you are approached with calamities, when you witness these things, even if they don't affect you, it's giving them meaning in a way that it provides a level of contentment and peace rather than confusion, chaos, despair. It does, understanding them to some degree. I say to some degree because whether we can fully grasp events is another thing. It does help, and that's what he focuses on. And I have to say from the beginning that belief in the afterlife is a really important part of this process. So as much as we can try to understand, make sense of what happens in this life, for this life, belief in the afterlife is an important part of inner peace. And that's why Nursi does spend extensive part of his writing talking about the afterlife. When he talks about his own personal experiences, which he does, he talks about his own sufferings, he talks about his own challenges. He always does refer to the afterlife as well. So that's a really important part of inner peace. So let's start with the content. So really, we need to come back to what the purpose of life is according to Islam or for a Muslim. And that helps to put things in perspective. You will hear me using the word perspective a number of times, and that's because perspective is so important. And in the Quran, it says, I have not created the jinn and humankind, but to know and worship me exclusively. So, and with that knowledge, I guess to worship God, knowledge is important. And that is an area that Nursi focuses a lot on, knowing God. If you know God, then you will love God. If you love God, there will be spiritual pleasure that comes with it. So knowledge of God is a key part of it, and his work focuses a lot on knowing God. Particularly, I would say he focuses on the notion of Tawhid, which means oneness of God. If we look at it as the literal meaning, it means to unify, unification, making something one. But from an Islamic perspective, it means the unity and absolute unification of God as one and true God without partners. So this is a big part of the discussion, that there is the one God who has no partners, which basically then has huge implications in theology, as in he has power over all things. He has knowledge over all things. He is aware of all things. So that Tawhid, understanding Tawhid is very important. And in my book, I talk about a Tawhid-centric worldview. We've heard of God-centric, but to me, it was really important to highlight the word Tawhid because it does have a very nuanced meaning, in the Islamic tradition. So that the oneness of God as understood in Islam. So there are many, many verses in the Quran that talk about Tawheed. It's about a quarter of the Quran actually in one way or another talks about Tawheed. This is one example just to give you a glimpse. Say we believe in the revelation which has come down to us, and in that which came down to you, our God and your God is one, and it is to him we bow in submission. So highlighting that oneness of God there, that notion of Tawheed, the oneness of God is coming through. And there are many, many examples like that. So these are Nursi's words. The true affirmation of divine unity is to attain a perpetual awareness of the divine presence and to confirm and believe almost with the certainty of seeing that everything emerges from the hand of God's power, and that in no way does he have any partner or assistant in his divinity, ownership, and governance of the universe. So in a way here, Nursi is explaining what he means or what he understands as Tawheed. And this perpetual awareness of the divine presence is quite an important part of it, and that's why I've highlighted it. It's this awareness, this in everyday life, being conscious that of divine presence, even when interacting with things around you, knowing that at the end of the day, let's put it this way, his hand is behind everything, or his wisdom is behind everything. His knowledge is behind everything. So nothing is outside God's, I guess, influence, if we can put it that way. And so how does one do this, as in come to this level of certainty of seeing, as he points out? And what are its implications? The first one is witnessing God in everything. So this, again, something that he focuses on greatly. It's this notion of other indicative. We'll talk more about that in future coming slides. And the names of God. There's a big knowing the names of God, what we call the Asma al-Husna, as mentioned in the Quran. The beautiful names of God are really important in understanding God in the universe. Another important part of a Tawhid centric, so God centric, call it a oneness of God centric worldview, seeing beauty in all, either in themselves or by their consequences. And we'll expand on that. And giving meaning to major calamities. Like how do you give meaning to calamities? Because usually they are the sticking points. Calamities, hardships are the sticking points. So I would say that these three are critical in attaining inner peace at the end of the day. Okay, so witnessing God in everything. What do we mean by that? So Nursi talks about how there are two types of seeing things, like as in observing, you could call it, or witnessing. He talks about it as meaning by the word, self-referential, concerning itself, or meaning by the letter, other indicative, pointing to its creator, where God's names are manifested on it. So really, again, it comes back to perspective, but how you view something. Like meaning by the word, meaning, think of even a word. You know, if you focus on the word, that word has a meaning on its own. So you can talk about that word, you can make it its own entity, and you know, look at it as one entity. Whereas when you see it as a letter, so if I was to choose a letter in this word R, basically it's highlighting that the R in itself does not mean much at all. But when you it's indicating something else, it's adding meaning to it adds meaning to a bigger meaning, basically, which is a word. Okay, so in a way, Nursi is saying that when you look at things, you have to look at them as being other indicative. In their own right, they don't mean much. They are indicating something else. He's saying they are indicating or pointing to the creator. So everything, therefore, every entity, every creation becomes a mirror of some kind to the creator. But I guess a key part of that also is, though, you need to bring all those, I guess, mirrors together and make a story out of it, or that is what helps us to get to know God better. Everything is indicating or referring to God, and so you bring all those references together, and you get a greater understanding of who God is. So when you take this approach, which he says we should, meaning by the letter, it completely transforms the way we see things. We don't look at things at face value, as we would say, but what is this indicating? What does this mean? What is it drawing our attention to? What is it about God that we can know by looking at this? So it helps. It really becomes like a reflector rather than an object of its own right. So when everything is viewed from the perspective of meaning by the letter, they are seen as signs of God. And that's where I said those signs then have to be read, have to be understood, and also often you need to bring those signs together. In this state, a person can read and witness the signs of his Lord everywhere, making him constantly aware of God's presence. So in this way, it's a bit like, and he uses the mirror, Nursi uses the mirror analogy a lot. It's like if you have mirrors everywhere and they're all reflecting the sun, you become conscious of the sun, not the mirror. So in a way, he's saying everything around the creation should make you conscious of God, and not get stuck on the creation. And that requires, I think that kind of thinking requires the rewiring of the brain to a large degree. It's almost, I feel like when I read and read Nursi's work, it's like it's a program, it's a particular program that you need to download into your brain and then apply it when you're looking around you. And it takes a bit of effort, but it's, and I do think it is possible. So God is constantly active in the physical world. All beings, events, and manifestation of God's names. And as I mentioned, he's very big on the names of God. And he talks about at least, every creation at least mirrors 20 names of God. So everything is a mirroring of God. Some are more comprehensive mirrors of God than other things. Human beings are the most comprehensive mirrors of God, being able to, I guess, reflect or manifest the names of God more than any other. And just as an example, probably a classical example, like I mentioned, we get to know Allah through the reflection of his names on the universe, and we see glimpses of his name, of Allah's names. And, for example, the mercy of a mother towards her child is I guess, a mirror or reflection or a manifestation of God's mercy. And there is a hadith that's very, reminds me of this. So you can see where Nursi gets his, I guess, discussions or arguments from. And in one particular hadith, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he sees this woman. She's lost her child. She's frantically looking for her child. It's an experience a lot of us have experienced. I did in the shopping center when my kids were younger. You frantically look for them. You think the worst. And then in this scenario, during the Prophet's time, she finds the child and she, she embraces her child and shows the affection. And the Prophet says to the companions around him, would this mother throw her child into the hellfire? And they say no, because they can see the compassion that's oozing out of that situation. And he says God's compassion towards his creation is greater than this mother's compassion towards her child. So, I mean, this particular hadith you can talk about, write volumes about, but the point I want to make at this for the purpose of this presentation is that the mercy or the compassion that we see in humans or even animals towards their, I guess, offsprings is a glimpse of the mercy and compassion that God has towards his creation. So it's an example of how when you witness that compassion and mercy, you can either see it and as what it is, a compassion and mercy, or you can think this is a manifestation. If this mother is so compassionate and merciful towards their child, imagine how merciful and compassionate God is towards his creation. So it's that kind of, I guess, programming that I'm talking about, where everything can bring us back to God, according to Nursi. So this is another example of how to understand this idea of names of God and how do we see them in creation. It's basically looks at a flower, and Nursi gives this example as well. And these are the names that are drawn out from that flower just by observing it. I won't go through it all, but it will give you an idea. The flower, we all love flowers, will be known and be loved. Loving the known one. It's got a particular shape, the flower. So determining of the outer form, the names of God that, can be reflected or connected to that is determiner, orderer, giver of form. Setting general limits and dimensions of form. So the one who does it has to be all-knowing, all-wise. So by looking at a mirror, at a flower, which acts as a mirror, all these names of God can come to a person's mind. But obviously, as you can see, it requires knowledge of God. It requires knowledge of the names of God, but it also requires a person to look at that flower as a mirror, something he greatly emphasizes. And therefore I am emphasizing. So the other thing with the names of God, and the words that I use in my book is the universe can be decoded through the names of God. Because not only are things reflecting the names of God, but sometimes through the opposites, we understand the existence of names of God. And this is something that's important in Nursi's writing as well. For example, you need to experience illness to appreciate the healer. If you've never been ill in your life, or if you've never witnessed anyone around you being ill, the concept of the healer would be foreign to you. It's like, what is that? Like, what does healing mean? If you've never been sick, you'll never understand what healing actually is. So sometimes you need to experience the absence of something to be able to appreciate the name. Again, justice, if in an ideal world, I guess, if we had justice all around us, again, you would not understand what justice is. That's all you've ever known. That's all you've ever experienced. So, but when you see injustice and you I guess, and you experience its, let's call it the ugliness of it, then you appreciate the name all just. So it's this kind of contrast or duality that he sees the wisdom of, its presence. Okay, I'm just conscious of the time. And so good and evil is that way too. If everything is good, you won't appreciate good based on, the way he writes. You have to have an absence of good to appreciate good. And I did this visual thing. So you can't, if this is all you've known, you can't appreciate anything else. If all you've seen ever in your life is black, you can't see the contrast. Whereas, so you need to have darkness and you need to have brightness. So similarly, if you've just had white, if your life was all good, if it was all, everything was monotonous, let's call it, you wouldn't actually appreciate it because that's all you've known. It's really when we have something is taken away or there's a contrast is when we appreciate it. And that's where you can see the writing when there's a contrast, and you see the names of God when there is a contrast like that. So that contrasting is a key part of knowledge, and experiencing contrast is a key part of knowing God, because with that contrast, it's the same, and there's no appreciation. Okay, so the next point is, so the names of God and getting to know God through the names of God is a critical part. The next part is beauty in all. The verse that's referred to is, who has created everything in the best way. Ahsani Taqweem. And Nursi says, everything in the universe, every event is either in itself beautiful, which is called essential beauty, or it is beautiful in regards to its outcomes, which is called relative beauty. Now, this could be considered a very big statement, a very big claim. How can everything be beautiful outright or through its outcomes? And again, this is why I emphasize afterlife. This would not fully make sense, or we wouldn't be able to, I guess, digest this if the afterlife didn't exist. And that's why he talks about afterlife, because he talks about how the afterlife is where this absolute justice takes place. And that's how you can make sense of suffering, because sometimes a person might experience nothing but suffering all through their life. It's in the afterlife where they will reap the rewards of that. So afterlife is a really important, belief in the afterlife is a really important part of making sense of this. But it's a claim that he makes. And he actually makes this claim based on this Quranic verse. So one thing is, there's some things that appear to be evil are not actually evil. So this is perspective again. It's all about perspective. Being pushed out of our comfort zone leads to growth. So we don't like being pushed out of our comfort zones, most of us. We actually don't like it, and we think it's a bad thing. But he actually, in his own words, life led monotonously on the couch of ease and comfort resembles not so much the pure good that is being as the pure evil that is non-being. So he associates, I guess, a monotonous life, not non-growth, as non-being, because there is no growth that's taking place. Your existence isn't being developed. It's just the same. Whereas growth is an essential part of life. Basically, if you're not growing, you're regressing, and that's not a good thing. Removing the minor evil cause would be a major evil. So that's another argument he makes. Something might be causing, some suffering, but he says the overall goodness of that thing, like if you remove that minor evil, it actually becomes a major evil. For example, rain. We've had some floods. We've had some serious floods here in Australia, and New South Wales currently is going through a lot of rain again. There was a lot of flooding. People have lost their homes. It's quite sad. So not saying that that's not sad or not tragic, but what he's saying is, okay, if we were to think, oh, it's raining a lot in New South Wales, Australia, we shouldn't have such a thing as rain. It's actually he's saying it's a major evil, because you would then have drought, you would not have a life, you would not have things growing, and we probably will go extinct as a result. So basically, you need to look at the bigger picture of things. You need to zoom out and see how a particular entity like fire or rain overall gives us benefits, and not zoom in and think of how something is affecting an entity of people. And it's not easy to think this way, especially if you're the one that's being immersed in the floods. But we'll talk more about that as well. What does it mean for someone who's suffering because of these greater, events that are taking place? But another principle he has related to evil is, will to desire evil is evil, but the creation of evil is not. And through this, he's basically, because I mentioned Allah is the all-powerful, all-knowing, nothing can happen without him. So often a theological question comes is, if evil is happening, then how is he letting it happen? And so Nursi responds to this by saying, the will to desire evil is evil, but the creation of evil is not. So it's a test in a way. It's a test for human beings. Evil is put out there. We're told not to do it. We've got a conscience. We've been created in a way we're not meant to do it. But if we do it, we can't say, God made me do it. Human willpower comes into it. And he tries to make that distinction. And even within that temptation with evil, existing of evil, like I mentioned, he looks at it from different angles, in the sense, if evil doesn't exist, we can't really appreciate good. So therefore, and we can't blame God for evil, is what he's saying. And he does actually say, know that evil is from yourself and good is from God. This is something that took a while for me to get my head around, but basically, in a way, it's like God is saying, and the way Nursi is explaining, he's put this perfect formula there. And if we follow that, if we follow the steps of that formula, we're going to have a very good life. If every human being did what they needed to do in this universe, on this earth, then we're going to thrive on earth. But if we're not doing what he has asked us to do and what we're capable of doing, then we're doing evil, and that evil is from ourselves. It does go a step further, I guess, to another level, as I said, where there is wisdom in the existence of evil, but basically he emphasizes that it's human beings that are making those decisions to commit evil. So as I mentioned, it is bigger than good and evil, what's good, and perspective is key. There could be thousands of wisdoms behind an act. Justice could be prevailing without direct link to what we see. So there could be this bigger picture where when we look at an incident, we're seeing a particular angle to it. We're seeing a particular perspective to it. Whereas there are multiple perspectives to an incident all the time. So we may not be seeing the bigger picture. An act may prevent a greater calamity. So it could be in a way like a wake-up call for a person. And so it might be good in that sense. An act can be a purification process for individuals. So, and this is where the metaphysical comes in. So a lot of what we see is in the physical world. We're trying to make sense of the physical realm. Whereas, when we're talking about purification or spiritual growth, challenges and tests in life are actually seen as a great way, potential way of growth, spiritual growth, because of how it could be because it humbles us. It could be because we realize that we're not this grand person who can do anything what we want when we want. It makes us acknowledge our limitations. And in a spiritual world, these kind of humility, humbleness, is an important part of life. An act may disadvantage us, but may serve a greater purpose. So again, just because it's not good for me, if it's good for 100 people, or it's good for the earth, then again, there's something bigger at play. But like I said, in all cases, true justice will prevail in the afterlife. An example that always comes to my mind when I think about this, the wisdom, with an analogy, when my children were younger, they're older now, but I had to get their vaccination done. This was before vaccinations, there was this, vac pro anti. So I'm not going into that discussion, but, when I had them, went to the doctor to get them vaccinated, one was, I think she had her 1-month-old vaccination. The other one had his 4-year-old vaccination. And me, I thought I'll get them both done at the same time. That wasn't such a wise move, because one saw the other one getting vaccinated, and it's like, I don't want to borrow that. But anyway, we were there, it was happening. And my kids were frantic. Kids don't like needles. And, he was crying. And I was just thinking afterwards, I was reflecting on that. I'm like, imagine there was this alien from outside Earth that saw that here I am holding my child's arm while this doctor's got this needle wanting to jab my child. If they didn't understand what the purpose behind the vaccination was, or they didn't understand why I was wanting to do it, or why the doctor was wanting to do it, how we thought this will help with, long-term diseases and so forth, they would think I was the meanest mother on earth. So I think this is what how life events are sometimes. We see a glimpse of it. We don't often know the bigger picture. We don't know what's happening behind, let's say, behind the scenes. We don't have that knowledge base, and we make interpretations based on what we see, and it's not always accurate. Or even if it is accurate, then again, afterlife comes to the forefront. That's an important part. So giving, the third one, it says 2, but it's actually 3, giving meaning to major calamities. This is a big part of that. And again, perspective is an important part of it. Perhaps you hate a thing and it is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing and it is bad for you. And Allah knows while you know not. Now, this in a way is telling us something might look good to you, but it might actually not be. Or you might not like something, but it might actually be good for you. What I realized over time, is that this verse requires trust in God. This is a big part of it, because you don't know. You have to trust that God knows best. And that kind of trust requires knowledge of God, but it requires more than that. It requires a relationship with God. But perspective is an important part. And I guess to better understand, things that can shed light on this is this particular verse, for example. And we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger, and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits. But give good tidings to the patient who, when disaster strikes, say, indeed, we belong to Allah, to God, and to him we will return. So this Quranic verse is telling us you're going to be tested. You're going to be challenged. And, it's going to be with your wealth, your children, your health, you're going to be tested. So God is telling us from the forefront that this life is about that. And it doesn't mean it's because he hates us, but he wants us to spiritually grow. So this is an important part of knowing what we're doing on earth. And these hadith sayings of the Prophet further add light on this. If God wants to do good to somebody, he afflicts him with trials. Hardships continue to befall a believing man and woman in their body, family, and property until they meet God burdened with no sins. So sufferings, hardships are here associated with purifications, and again, that would not fully make sense unless the person believes in the afterlife, because the person who believes in the afterlife, it's like, this world is temporary. I'm going to live it for 40, 60, 80, 100 years. Afterlife is eternal. So I'm going through these challenges because Allah, God wants me to have a life of eternal bliss in the next life. And just very quickly, so the Prophet comes as an example, and the Prophet Muhammad is known as the Habibullah, the beloved of God. So he's seen in the Muslim world as the pinnacle of in the Islamic tradition as the pinnacle of humanity. But yet when you look at his life, it's really actually quite full of challenges. He lost his father before he was born, his mother when he was 6, so he was an orphan at a very young age. He buried 6 out of 7 of his children. He was exiled from his homeland. It's like, you name it, he experienced it. It's that kind of thing, like all types of challenges. But yet he was still known as the Habibullah, beloved of Allah. So to me, this shows or highlights that we shouldn't associate challenges and suffering with God hating us. Because and the life of the Prophet is highlighting that to us. If he's the beloved of God, but yet he went through all these challenges, then if we're going through challenges, God must not hate us. It's quite a logical conclusion you can draw. And on one occasion, this is another one that sheds further light on this idea. Prophet Muhammad was asked, who are the most severely tested? Like, who gets the hardest tests in the world? And he said, the Prophet said, the prophets get tested the most, then the next best, and then the next best. A person is tested according to his religious commitment. If he is steadfast in his religious commitment, he will be tested more severely. And if he is frail in his religious commitment, his test will be according to his commitment. Trials will continue to afflict a person until they leave him walking on the earth with no sin on him or her. So again, associating tests and challenges with purification, spiritual growth, which are then are really important for the afterlife. So when we see the challenges in this way, it really changes our perspective of those challenges. What does this mean to me? So just with this also, Nursi talks about how there's 2 types of mercy. One of them is through the God's mercy and beauty, like things that we see outwardly, the mercy or compassion, say, of a mother towards a child, example I gave. But sometimes the equilibrium, like even something as when we see, when a volcano happens, explodes, or earthquakes happen. This is the Earth's way of dealing with an imbalance that's taking place, and so these are needed so that life on Earth can continue. And yes, there could be suffering that takes place in that, and the earthquake is a very good example. Earthquakes are needed for the Earth to maintain a particular balance. And if there are humans that are being impacted by that, he says it could be a means of spiritual progress. The innocent will be recompensed. If innocent die, permanent good life in the hereafter. And Nursi, when he talks about these incidents of an earthquake, for example, he refers to God as all-wise and all-compassionate. So there's wisdom. He's highlighting that there's wisdom in those incidents happening. there's a bigger picture, there's an angle that's looking to every single person who is part of that experience. And basically, if they have suffered innocently, they will be recompensed for it. And so he highlights that there is justice on the individual and on the collective. So in conclusion, inner peace is a product of one's worldview. It really is about how what your worldview is and what your perspective on life is. And a Tawhid-centric, a God-centric worldview requires a perspective that focuses on God's signs in the universe. So really connecting with God through what we see around us. Everything is beautiful outright or in regards to its outcomes. Major calamities need to be addressed for the heart to be fully content, So we need to be able to understand them, at least to some degree. This worldview becomes a source of inner peace in Nursi's thought. And there is a correlation, I believe, between one's inner peaceful state and how they function in society. So that's a conclusion to my presentation. And I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Züleyha, for this wonderful and very peaceful speech. From your presentation, I would like to say, I just understand once again that even our world is in turmoil sometimes, or even you yourself feel all in turmoil. It's at the end of the day, it's all peace with getting to know our Creator, Allah, and these challenges we face in this world. I believe it really makes this world memorable for us, if you see it that way. We can have our questions in the chat box right now. Okay, we can go ahead and start with our first question. It asks, according to the verse, we are going to be tested. Does that be applied to all people? Because we see some people, especially oppressors, who seem to be not suffering and not being tested and having joy in their lives.
It's a good question, and it is, I would say, somewhat complex. But this is where, like, I've kind of thrown at you verses and hadith and what Sayyid Nursi said. So bringing them together and trying to understand a particular person's scenario is not easy. Like, the one thing that comes to my mind is the hadith I mentioned. Those who are closest to Allah, to God, get tested the most, because it's a purification for them. Because God wants to basically meet that person pure. That's one angle to it. The other angle to it that comes to my mind is you really don't know who is suffering and who is not sometimes. Like, we see physical suffering around us, that's more noticeable, but there could be a lot of internal suffering that we don't know as well. Like, a person could be going to bed in a palace, sleeping on a feather pillow and so forth, but they could have the, I guess, the highest levels of anxiety, the highest levels of uncertainty, the highest levels of threat, which doesn't give them a moment of peace. And so it's very hard to say this person is suffering and this person is not. And that's why I don't think people who look like they're getting away with it, are they really, is my first question. And my other thing is, maybe the afterlife is the place where they will really see the consequences of their actions. I think that this is something I've come to realize recently greatly. I often would associate, we see people all the time. You see someone and you think they live a particular life just based on the way they're looking. When I speak to some of these people, I realize that they have so much suffering within them. And you think, I wouldn't want to be in their place, especially if they're not a nice person. If they're a good person, I pray for them, and hopefully, they'll able to see they'll be at more peace with themselves, or again, they will see the reward in the afterlife. So it's much more complex. I hope my answer makes sense.
Thank you. We have two more from our chat box. One is a request if you could tell us a little more about the Nursi and his life.
I'll do it very quickly. so Nursi was born in Turkey. He was of Kurdish background, and he was born in the 20th century, 19 no 1960 I can't remember, 1970, 18 something in the 19th century. He did die in 1960. I remember that. What's interesting about his life is that he lived through some very difficult times, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and basically there were huge reforms taking place in Turkey. And the reforms we're talking about is changing dress code, changing the language. So he felt like his identity was basically being stripped away from him. Furthermore, he was exiled from his village, and he spent most of his life in exile. He was also imprisoned for many years because it was claimed that he was trying to bring down the state of the time. So to me, that's why his life is extra special, because he did live a difficult life. So in a way, he practiced what he preached, if I can put it that way. And he gave meaning to things that happened. And for example, in one part of his work, he talks about when he's in prison, and his imprisonment was quite difficult. As in, in one occasion, he talks about it's very winter, it's cold, it's a cold winter, and they would throw water to the ground of the cell he's in, and the window of the cell is broken, and the water on the ground freezes. That's how cold he is. They basically want him to die from the cold. He doesn't die. But he talks about these experiences, and he says, if I didn't believe in the afterlife, I would not have been able to, tolerate or digest even 1 minute of unjustly being in prison. So those kind of reflections are very powerful. But also, for example, when he's in prison, he uses it as a means to educate other people. He talks about it as like a school. So every opportunity he has, he tries to, make a positive out of it. It's so much so that, there's someone else, incarcerated person in prison who is learning from Nursi, and he's benefiting from it so much that he wants his sentence to be extended so he can stay in prison to spend more time with Nursi. But, so his life is one of challenges like that, and his writing is based on those challenges. So in a nutshell, that's probably what I could say.
Again, thank you for the brief introduction about Said Nursi. The next question is from Joseph. He asks, I was wondering whether you, as an expert who studied inner peace extensively, would share one or two of your personal practices for staying in a state of inner peace in situations when you are overwhelmed by daily life stressors.
There's so many. To be honest, I would say that, when I said it's like a program, I really feel like it's, you have to program your brain, or you need to rewire, as we would say in psychology, probably we need to rewire our brain to be able to have a particular response. One, I guess, major incident that happened is when my brother was diagnosed with cancer, brain cancer, a few years ago. That was a very difficult time for me. Especially because he's got a young family, and he was in hospital for months, and then he had a stroke. So there was so much sort of trauma happening at one stage, altogether. So what I found myself is trying to say, what's the good that can come out of this? And it takes a while. You do need to give yourself time to grieve as well. So it's not like you can say to yourself, it's okay, it doesn't hurt. That would be denial. But thinking to yourself, what good can come out of this situation? And one thing now, like, he's actually survived that. We actually thought he was going to die. He survived that, but he's had the impact of the stroke on his body. He can never work. He was an optometrist. He can never work again. His life has completely changed. But I look at it, and he's at home as of the time. I'm thinking he can't, he can't even commit sin if he wanted to. His body doesn't allow it. And all that challenges he went through, hopefully that's a purification. So in my mind, when I look at him, I think of someone who's almost, only God knows, but almost guaranteed paradise. So when I think of it that way, it really soothes my soul. Rather than thinking, poor thing, he had this wonderful life and he can't do anything now. I think he's almost got a guaranteed paradise, and that reading the situation like that really helps me. So I'm conscious of time, but hopefully that's a good example. But so can I just say, with everyday life stresses, I have these, in today's world, we hear about boundaries a lot. I feel like with our surroundings, we also need boundaries with the information that we take in. And this is something Nursi did actually. When World War I or II was happening, he stopped reading listening to the radio. They didn't have internet then, obviously. And he stopped reading the newspaper. And he focused on what he could, and that was his writings, because he felt that was his contribution to the world. He was trying to leave, I guess, his legacy through his writing. And so I think sometimes we need to focus on our circle of influence and do the best that we can, and sometimes disconnect from what's happening, especially when we're feeling overwhelmed, because there is so much out there. It's very easy to get overwhelmed, especially in this time of social technology, where something happens on the other side of the world and I hear about it the next minute, and it feels like it's happened in my backyard. We need to be able to limit the information that we receive or restrict it, so that we don't, absorb ourselves in it, because it's not in our circle of influence.
I guess this might be our last question. It says that it could be a broad question, but I'm curious whether you believe in harmony between science and faith, and whether or not you see a relation between scientific-based psychological practices like mindfulness or positive psychology to attain inner peace, and the knowledge of God and believe in the afterlife from a theological perspective.
Absolutely. I think there is harmony. But I do, to be honest, I'm not a psychologist, and it's an area that I'm starting to, gain a lot of interest in. And I think that the field or discipline of psychology has got a lot to offer, but it is, so there are, if there are proven practices like mindfulness, positive psychology, that can help to attain inner peace, no, definitely they would be things that we could benefit from. And so I like the general thinking, I would say with any Muslim, is that there is a huge correlation of faith and science work together. They don't actually work as separate entities, because we do need experimentation. We need to explore, what works, but at the same time, that wouldn't be done as a severed from belief in God, belief in the afterlife. And I do believe those two worlds can come together harmoniously and produce amazing strategies and, methods of helping people. It's a very new, I would say it's a very new area in our time. And I really hope that it evolves and grows in the coming years and decades.
Yeah, I believe these are our final questions. I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Züleyha, again, for being with us today with this very special topic. And thank you for joining us today, everyone.